Angie Rupert from Rupert Law Group. We handle almost exclusively E-2 visas, so no matter what treaty country you're from or where you want to be, we can help. Today, we are joined by Anna Kerner Anderson of Kerner Anderson, her own law firm. Hi, Anna.
Hi there.
Great to speak with you. So Anna has a very interesting background that I know everybody's going to want to know a little bit about. She worked at the embassy in London, the U.S. Embassy in London, and also the consulate in Ciudad Juárez in Mexico handling E-2 visas. Is that correct, Anna?
That's correct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she was a consular officer. She was the person that got to tell everybody, congratulations, you got your E-2 visa, right? For most people.
For most people,
okay.
Yes.
Most people, fair enough. So Anna and I are going to talk a little bit about some of the common questions we both get because Anna is also an immigration attorney. And questions we both get about the interview. How does it go? As an attorney, as an immigration attorney, I can tell you the experience of my other clients, but Anna can give you an extra special kind of behind the scenes view of what it is that the consular officers are looking for, the types of things they want to see, red flags in cases, things that they think are great, and on, right, Anna?
yes, I can.
Yeah.
Let me give you the
yeah, so let's start kind of with that. When someone comes to an interview at a consulate, and particularly with E-2s, but any interview really, what are like the top 2 or 3 things that they can do that kind of sets that interview on a good path?
Yeah, I like to always tell people that, that first question the officer asks, usually it's pretty vague, and it's vague for a reason. They ask a pretty broad question, and then you as the applicant, that's your opportunity to kind of set the scene for the rest of the interview. So, and that's particularly true for E-2 visas in my experience and in my opinion, because, every consulate and every embassy varies in the amount of time that they give the E-2 visa officer to look at the application. So typically in most places, you'll have submitted a large amount of documents ahead of time before the interview. However, you're not sure when you get to the interview if the officers looked at any of those documents. So the interview is very important from that perspective, because you're educating the officer about what was in that packet, and you're really setting the scene for the rest of the interview. And typically these interviews are pretty short. So in my opinion, that first question, that's pretty broad, like what are you going to do in the United States, or what's the business that you're investing in the United States. That's your opportunity to kind of put the whole case in a nutshell in a 30-second response. But that's really the most important part of the interview, in my opinion, is that first question, because that sets the scene for the rest of the interview, really.
Yes. And Anna, you touched on something that's very interesting. And when I first started doing immigration law, was shocking to me and is shocking to many of my clients, is that the officer many times has not seen anything, or has only seen a couple of documents, or is only going off the notes of someone else who went through it. Is that accurate?
Yes, exactly. So it varies. The processing varies, greatly depending on what embassy you're applying in. So for example, when I was in London, we had a whole E-2 visa unit that would go through every E-2 visa application and then basically give us kind of a brief, that of whether or not they thought the person qualified and what they thought we should kind of ask and what documents they thought maybe were missing in the initial application, right? That was a very, different experience than what I had in Mexico. Whereas, Mexico, we were given the cases 1 or 2 hours before the interview, and nothing written on them, nothing had been reviewed on them, and we just got the materials alone with no prior screening at all. So yeah, I mean, in those cases, that there's going to be an officer, if you only have that 2 hours when you're expected to do other interviews during that time frame, right? So you're just kind of fitting in that E-2 case with the rest of your caseload. And, you're also typically, the E-2 visa officer is not really a business trained person. I mean, when you get hired into the Foreign Service, you're called a generalist. And that means that you're supposed to kind of know a little bit about everything, but not a whole lot about anything. So typically the people who are E-2 visa officers, they'll select them because maybe they had a business background, but typically they don't have a business background. So, if you don't have a business background, you want to make sure that the information about your business is very digestible for the officer. And typically, so the officer officer can understand that layman's terms, they would look at the business plan and potentially the cover letter from the attorney, because those are going to be kind of the two things that spell out what the officer needs to know about the case typically.
Yeah. So that's interesting too. I mean, and I think that you are maybe kind of unusual in the fact that you were an attorney, right? I mean, most of the consular officers are not attorneys.
That's correct. Yeah. In Mexico, none of the other E-2 visa officers were attorneys. In London, my colleague, there was only two of us in London, and he was also an attorney, but right, that's not typical.
Right. And that's something else that I think is kind of a surprise to a lot of clients, is these are not attorneys, nor are they necessarily, I mean, they're certainly not accountants going through P&Ls and that type of thing. I think certainly at a glance, but they don't, maybe it's not a lot of training on that. That actually brings me to my next question. Another thing that was a little bit surprising to me was that there are many places, and I've learned this through client experience, but also through a presentation that I went to once by another consular officer, that if you go to a place, now London would not be one of these places, Ciudad Juárez as well, like Toronto, there's a variety of places that do lots and lots of E-2s, but there are some places that do very few E-2s, either non-treaty countries or treaty countries that are just not as common. For example, I had this situation in Bangladesh that the officers really have no training at all regarding these visas. Is that
Yeah,
true?
that's correct. If it's a location where they don't have very many E-2 visas, they're not going to have a specific dedicated officer for E-2 visas. And then you're dealing with, like I always say, educating the officer, because that officer is going to have seen, multiple B1, B2s, probably student visas all day long. And then they get to your case and they're going to be probably asking you questions that aren't 100% relevant to the visa class, just because you're the first one that might be the first case that they've ever seen in the E-2 visa class, right? So sometimes
Crazy.
sometimes you do have to educate the officer on what the requirements are. So if you start getting questions that are really bizarre, that you think, what does that have to do with my business? That's why, because, you might get an officer that has never seen an E-2 visa before. And then that's why you get some of those bizarre questions.
Crazy. Yeah, that was definitely an experience of one of my clients in Bangladesh. Luckily approved, and it all kind of went well in the scheme of things. But yeah, it was pretty obvious based on what he told me how the interview went that they just didn't have a ton of experience with it. But so let's just talk a little bit about some of the common, I guess let's start here. What are the most common questions that you as a consular officer would ask, just in a kind of what I'll call a vanilla E-2, right? Kind of a brand new business. They seem to kind of have most of their documentation together in a pretty orderly fashion, that kind of thing. Like, what would you just generally ask for someone like that?
Well, we were always trained to kind of evaluate how the business was going to impact the U.S. economy, right? It's the U.S. government that's adjudicating the visa. So more than, kind of about you in the business, it's more about what is the impact to the U.S. because I'm the U.S. government issuing the visa. So I always tell people, like, we were told to look at the number of employees that you were going to have in your 5-year business plan, what your revenues were going to be. So numbers are really important. I always, numbers were definitely a question that we were told to ask. Specifically, again, to kind of go back to the officer may not have a business background. The employee, the number of employees is something the officer can digest and understand. If you're going from 5 employees to 20 employees and by year 5, that's impressive to an officer, even, as long as you can articulate why you made those projections, right? I mean, everything has to make sense to the officer too, but typically those were kind of the main questions. What is the business? How, if it's in a competitive industry that has a lot of, competition, how are you going to be successful? If I give you a 5-year visa, what can you tell me to make me convinced that, the business is going to be around in 5 years time? So that's, revenues, employees. Numbers are pretty important for officers. They like to be able to
Right.
document those things in their notes. Typically at the end of the day, the officer has to justify why they made the decision they made. A supervisor will go through 10 to 20% of their adjudications, and if the notes don't justify why the decision was made, they'll get called into the office and they have to justify why they made that decision. So I always tell my clients now on this side, like, you want to give the officer those notes that they can put in their case so that it makes it easy for them to approve it, because they have a easy justification. So numbers are important. Those projections are important, and also kind of the data that you use to come up with those projections. Like, if you just throw out there, yeah, of course we're going to grow, we're in a really, good area, we have a really good business model, we're going to grow. Like, that's not enough for the officer. Again, it is really an administrative process, right? But that's not enough for the officer to hang their hat kind of on, well, that sounds like something I can use to justify the approval. So numbers are super important.